Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbard Gaming. Today I've got another utterly pointless comparison for you. If you're new here, this is where I play two versions of the same game from start to finish, side by side with commentary. In this video, I'll be comparing the Neo Geo MVS arcade version of Samurai Shodown to the Sega CD version. First up, here's a look at the specs of the hardware for each platform, while I tell you just a smidge about the game itself. SNK released Samurai Shodown onto their MVS Neo Geo arcade platform in 1993. The game was a success in both Japan and America, never reaching Street Fighter II levels of insanity, but it was in the top 6 highest grossing arcade games of Japan in 93 and the top 5 in America for 94. Samurai Shodown offered something different from the burgeoning market of Street Fighter II clones. It was a weapons-based fighter that was superficially similar to SF2, but the gameplay experience was noticeably different. It's a little slower and more strategic. It really punishes players who miss with heavy attacks, setting them up to get severely counterattacked. The rage gauge, or Ikara gauge as it was known in the original Japanese version, fills as a character receives damage, and when completely full, makes that character's attack stronger for a very short time. Samurai Shodown was ported to many systems back in its heyday, including the Genesis, SNES, and Sega CD. You may think that the Sega CD version is just a port of the Genesis version with CD music. If you think that, well, you're wrong! The cartridge and Sega CD versions are very different and were made by entirely different development teams at different companies. The Sega CD port arrived in 1995. The game has load times, but really they aren't too terrible, and you can turn off the after-fight quotes if you want to speed things up a bit more. Like the Genesis version of Shodown, this one is missing the giant character Earthquake. The Sega CD version also ditched the scaling of the arcade version. The system could technically have handled it, but it would have almost certainly meant a severe reduction in the refresh rate from 60 frames per second down to somewhere between 15 and 30. Now there are a lot of things missing and changes made in the Sega CD port, and I'll get into specifics about that during the comparison in just a few seconds. Okay, here's my recording methodology for this one. I did use save states in the Sega CD version here and there, just to speed up the recording process and try to create similar situations to the arcade playthrough in certain stages. I've also eliminated losses and the load times in the Sega CD version because I respect your time. Remember, it's not about my gameplay. I'm not claiming to be awesome at Samurai Shodown. It's about showing you the games compared in the most efficient way possible. I'll show you a little bit of loading in the Sega CD version at the conclusion after the comparison. Alright, let's get on with it. Okay, here we go. You can see that the presentation is really similar between the two versions from the get-go. There are a lot of differences to discuss between these two games though, so I'm going to dole those out as we go along. First and foremost, the scaling effect when you get a certain distance away from your enemy is gone on the Sega CD, as I did mention earlier. It's not a huge loss in my opinion, but they could have made the backgrounds a little bit longer to compensate. Instead, their solution was to truncate a bit off the sides of all of the stages. In Gen On stage here, there are fewer lighting effects and a smaller variety of background tiles in the Sega CD version. Remember, on Neo Geo, pretty much everything is a sprite. On Sega CD, they have to use tile maps for the backgrounds and are limited by the amount of RAM available. The colors are also darker in the Sega CD version, and there are fewer of them. Also, the lack of foreground objects like those big stacks of wood and the fires on Sega CD really stands out. It makes the game look emptier than it should in a number of stages. Also, while the Sega CD version has the character's idle animation in it, at the start of round 1 for whatever reason, it's turned off. The arcade turns it off from round 2 and beyond. But I have to say they really did a great job of bringing over the characters and their animation frames. They're larger than many other fighting games on the platform, and are fast and easy to control. Oh, and you'll notice that the referee, Kuroko, is missing from the Sega CD version. This is especially weird since the other developers didn't have any issues including him in the Genesis version of the game from nearly 2 years earlier. Now, the music on the Sega CD version seems to have been recorded directly from the Neo Geo cartridge version of Samurai Shodown and sounds pretty much identical to that version. The sound effects and voices are way lower quality, which is super weird because they shouldn't be. The PCM sound chip built into the Sega CD should have handled those samples just fine. These sound almost like they're coming from the DAC or digital audio converter on the Genesis's YM2151 FM synthesis chip. The low quality is really kind of annoying. And during the victory quote, you'll notice that on Neo Geo, people carry the defeated opponent away in a coffin. Sega CD keeps the extra character art, but omits the coffin part. Why? They could have easily done that. Now, a quick difference between the two versions is that the announcer at the beginning and end of fights is missing from the Sega CD version for some reason. Again, it's another puzzling omission. Anyway, Kyoshiro's stage here looks a lot different between the two versions, and it's not all bad this time. Just check out the floor. On Sega CD, it's got a more natural wood color for the floors. On Neo Geo, the colors on the floor really stick out. They're more stylized, and it can be hard to see the characters against them sometimes. So hey, good change on that one. But bad changes include getting rid of the parallax layers in the arcade, but you only see them during the scaled out views, so I can understand why they're not here. Now if you look at the audience in the background, they have much more animation on Neo Geo. Some characters that wave their arms around in the background in the original game just stand totally still on Sega CD, like little statues. Other than that, and some of the colors being a smidge drab in the Sega CD port, they did a nice job with the level of detail in the background here. Now some other things missing from the Sega CD that I'll point out now, the screen flashing effect during some of the fiercer attacks is gone, but I'd actually consider that a plus. The energy bars no longer flash or play a chime when a character is at low health. That one was kinda useful, and I wish they had kept it, and I'll talk about it again a bit later. Also, while the Sega CD retains the blood spray that sometimes happens when you defeat an opponent at the end of a match, it gets rid of the other ending animation where you cut an enemy in half and money flies out of them, giving you points. And it's kind of weird that that's missing from the Sega CD version because it's in the Genesis version. Meanwhile, in the Genesis cartridge version, they got rid of the blood spray, but kept the enemies getting cut in half. And if you've seen Hikyaku, the delivery guy that throws food, money, and bombs in the arcade game, well, he's gone on Sega CD. The bomb items are missing from the Sega CD version altogether, but the other two items are present. But they just drop out of the sky. Next up we have Charlotte's stage. First, we see a weapon clash on Neo Geo. These do happen on the Sega CD version too, but when they do, they're missing the finger pressing a button icon right above the characters. As for Charlotte's stage itself, it looks pretty nice on Sega CD. It doesn't have quite as much detail as the Neo Geo/arcade original, but there are a few things I actually like better in the Sega CD version. I prefer the colors overall on it, and I've got to say that the fire roaring in the fireplace at the back, it's weird that that's not in the original game, but it is in this one, and it actually looks nicer and adds a little personality to it. Now on the downside, the painting in the background has a lot less detail on Sega CD. Again, this kind of makes sense since we don't zoom out and ever see it in more detail on the Sega CD version. We're also missing the destructible candles from the foreground on Sega CD. There's definitely some stuff missing, and you can tell the game is using a much smaller amount of colors on screen, but at least there are a few positives. Positives like these giant statues of the women in the background that are surprisingly great on Sega CD, with a lot of detail that you may not have been expecting. They're way more detailed here than in the original cartridge version on Genesis. In fact, this entire stage looks much better on Sega CD than on the Genesis version. They even tried to mimic the reflection of the floor tiles here. Another weird detail that I'll point out is that the characters are placed vertically higher up on the screen on Sega CD than they are in the Neo Geo original. It doesn't affect gameplay at all, and I guess someone figured that it'd help people focus more on the action since not a lot of other reasons would make much sense, but I'll speculate further shortly. Now, Charlotte herself looks nearly perfect despite having a noticeably reduced palette. I really have to compliment the devs on the characters in the Sega CD port. They look great and surprisingly close to the arcade originals. Okay, sorry about this, I skipped the cutscene on Neo Geo by accident. It's similar but a tad fancier on Neo Geo, as you probably have guessed by this point. Then we're on to bonus round number 1. And why did they replace the damaged wall of the arcade original with just an empty black void on Sega CD? The blank black background here gives the Sega CD version a very unfinished look, making it seem more like a beta than a final release. You can also see the floor and the rest of the foreground and background are a bit darker on Neo Geo. Anyway, this first bonus round is otherwise very close in both versions of Samurai Shodown that we're looking at today. And that's only true of this first bonus round. The second two bonus rounds are missing things on the Sega CD version, and they're weird things to be missing, which I'll talk about when we get there. Alrighty, next on the old chopping block is Wanfu. Either he'll be really easy or really difficult, whatever the AI at that moment decides. So let's talk about his stage a bit first. This one has some interesting cuts in the Sega CD version. On the Neo Geo original, you can see there's a complicated tile pattern on the floor, and especially in the center of the shrine. On the Sega CD version, the floor looks like it has a very simple carpet on it, and the design in the center is quite a bit simpler. Speaking of simpler, the shadows cast by the giant statues are gone on Sega CD. The statues themselves are much more simplified in their colors than those from Charlotte's stage, and the walls and backgrounds are all significantly simplified. They did manage to keep some of the rain effect, but if you look carefully, it's different. On Sega CD, the rain never crosses the top of the wall in the background, while in the Neo Geo original, the rain falls in front of that wall in the background. It seems like the devs just didn't notice this, but who knows? Maybe they did and there's just another reason they did it this way. On Neo Geo, this is another stage that has a parallax layer when zoomed out. Since the Sega CD version doesn't scale, that layer is missing here. Also, regarding the storm in this stage, on Neo Geo, there are occasional lightning flashes. These don't happen on the Sega CD version, and the rain pattern itself is also a bit simplified. Another thing I could toss in here while we have some time is that the POW text next to the rage gauge at the bottom of the screen is a lot smaller in the Sega CD version. Now it gets larger in both versions as the gauge fills up, but even at its largest size, it's a bit smaller than the max size in the Neo Geo original. I mentioned before about the players being slightly higher up on the screen and wondered why that was. I think it may be because of the elevated UI elements. The credits counter is a bit higher up, which in turn seems to have pushed the rage gauge up a little higher, which in turn seems to have made the developers decide to push the characters up a little higher. So, mystery solved, maybe? And I swear, sometimes the Neo Geo game, some enemies just never stop blocking. They block with inhuman speed and precision, and it can feel super cheap when this happens. There are times where they'll be recovering from missing a huge attack, especially Wan Fu here, with his big long-range sword slash that hits twice. When he misses, you've got what appears to be a huge opening to do some damage and punish him. But sometimes, no matter how fast you get that attack in, when the game decides it doesn't want to lose, it'll just block in a situation that no human being could have blocked in. Super annoying to say the least. Alright, next up we have Galford. This is another stage with some pretty interesting differences. The devs at Funcom took an interesting approach with this one on Sega CD. The ground is really well done. It's not identical to the arcade game, but it conveys the feeling of the original at least, and it looks very close. The giant ship in the background, however, suffers from severely reduced detail. They oversimplified it, and the color is also much different than in the Neo Geo original. Something else that's drastically different is the crowd. There's still a lot of people in the crowd on Sega CD, but if you look closely, you'll see some characters look almost the same as the Neo Geo arcade game, while others look completely different, and they repeat a lot. Now on Neo Geo, there are lots of unique characters in the crowd, instead of all of the repeated characters we see on Sega CD. Also, while there are no barrels in the foreground on Sega CD for the characters to destroy, they did put a bunch of barrels in the background right in front of the main crowd. Now on Neo Geo, there's also a second large ship all the way to the right side of the screen with its own crowd of people on it. Aside from that, we see some lovely blue water, a nice colorful sunset, and another ship off in the distance. The ships are both missing on Sega CD. The colors in the sky and water are greatly reduced, and the fact that the water barely even looks like water at all is weird. It's just one solid color. But they did try to simulate a reflection of the setting sun in the water on the Sega CD version. It doesn't look great, but it's something, I guess. One final note on the crowd, they're way more animated on Neo Geo. There is some animation in the Sega CD's crowd, but not nearly as much. I've also got to say that this stage in particular seems kinda claustrophobic, like it's much smaller than it should be. Now I doubt it's reduced any more than any of the other stages in the game, but I just find it to be much more noticeable in this stage versus most of the others. Now as with pretty much all of the characters, Galford here looks excellent. I can't believe anyone would have any complaint about the way the characters look in Sega CD Samurai Shodown. Yes, there is some cut animation, but really, it's pretty minor. Alright, this here's Temtem. His stage comes off considerably better than Galford's. We can see obvious color reduction and changes all over the place in this stage. Just look at the floor and the waterfalls in the background. But it still works pretty well on Sega CD, so let's figure out why they did some of the things they did here. We'll start with the waterfalls. On Neo Geo, they have some fairly simple animation, but it's multiple frames. If you look at the one in the center of the screen here, you can watch essentially rows of water stream all the way from the top to the bottom. On the Sega CD version, they use a simple repeating tile pattern in most of the center fall. And the way they did this, it doesn't even need to be animated. They're just color cycling. Color cycling is basically changing the colors assigned to tiles. How can we tell it's color cycling? Well, if you zoom in and look closely, the shapes in the water don't ever change. Only the colors of the shapes change. It's a simple trick that devs have been using for things like waterfalls in games since the 8-bit era. Now this is another stage that's a little too truncated on the sides in my opinion. In the Neo Geo MVS version, we see angled statues and some fancy bricks and foliage at the edges of the stage. On Sega CD, those things are missing because of how much they've cut off both the left and right edges of the screen. Also, the color of the legs and the stone carvings is different in both versions. Finally, for this stage, the patchy grass is a little more unique and less rigidly pattern-based than the Sega CD version, and the wavy reflections in the water are simpler on Sega CD versus Neo Geo as well. Tam himself, again, looks nearly perfect in the Sega CD version, but there are times where you'll notice a bit fewer animation frames on him if you look carefully. After the match, we get one of the cutscenes here, and there's much more fire, and it's animated much more rapidly on Neo Geo. On Sega CD, they used a simpler flame effect. Alrighty, so two things for the second bonus round. First, the colors in the Sega CD version are the same as they were in bonus round 1. On Neo Geo, we can see it's more red. On the Neo Geo, there's an arrow pointing up at the top center of the screen where a training dummy can pop down from above. On Sega CD, this training ground is identical in every way to the first one. It's missing the dummies that can come from the top of the screen. We still only have the 3 slots at the bottom. One last thing you may not have noticed, Kuroko, the referee, holds up a flag that corresponds to each player every time they land a hit on the other player, which was a really nice touch back when this game came out. He's keeping track of points, which seems kind of unnecessary since the loser pretty much always dies, but hey, attention to detail, right? Alright, mirror match time. One thing I forgot to mention earlier is we're missing not only the idle animation at the start of the matches, but also some of the unique character animation, like Haomaru drinking from his jug, spitting, and then tossing the thing away. It is included in the game, we see it during the ending, but it's missing from the actual fights themselves. Now there are some very interesting changes here, well, interesting to me at least, in this background. At first glance, it looks like Funcom stuck pretty close to the original, with slightly drabber colors in some parts, and slightly more vibrant colors in other parts. But we'll come back to that shortly. Check out the ground here first. In the original Neo Geo arcade version, it only goes up to about your character's waists. On Sega CD, the ground goes up higher. It's about chest level, almost shoulder level, so it's a lot taller. And the more I look at it, the weirder it is. It also pushes everything else in the background upward vertically. The water in the background has a simple 3-frame animation on Sega CD. 4 frames if you count the second frame, which plays on frames 2 and 4. Meanwhile, on Neo Geo, the water animation is a bit more complex than that. So as far as the colors go, I would say that the rocky ground is definitely duller on Sega CD, but I actually prefer the color of the water on Sega CD to the Neo Geo original. Now going back to the Neo Geo, in that version we get a few light rays, looking like God rays, coming off the sun. The sun and the rays are missing from the Sega CD version, which you can really only see the sun itself on Neo Geo when you're zoomed out, but you can see the rays even when it's zoomed in. The clouds and mountains in the background use much fewer colors on Sega CD also. Despite that stuff, overall, I think this is one of the best looking stages in the Sega CD version of the game. Jubei's stage is another one that's been cut back quite a bit. The most egregious omissions are the removal of the foreground bamboo stalks that can be cut. After that, just look at the ground. On Sega CD, we have a very simple repeating pattern coupled with a repeated dithered pattern above it. On the Neo Geo original, we see dramatically more detail on the floor, and that detail goes all the way back to the hut. I've really got to say, a few of the stages in Sega CD Samurai Shodown just feel like the artists phoned it in, and this is one of them. The simplifications here are just a little too extreme. There's no way there wasn't enough memory or video memory to have more unique tiles in this stage. It's incredibly simple. This is one stage that looks quite a bit better, I would say, in the cartridge version on Genesis than it does in this Sega CD version. In that version, they use a lot of varied tiles on the ground. They also have ground details that go all the way back to the hut, just as in the arcade version, and they don't give up halfway to the hut like we see in this Sega CD port. The only problem in the cartridge version is that the scale is wrong, and we only get to see like a tiny bit of the hut. Since I am already complaining anyway, let me sound off one more time about the low quality of the digitized voices in the Sega CD port. Just going back to edit this video, they're really starting to get to me. They remind me of hearing the digitized screams in Commodore 64 games like Way of the Exploding Fist. If you're old like me, and you want to say you get that reference, hey, feel free to do so in the comments. Oh, and sometimes in the arcade version there are gusts of wind that blow leaves around, and this is entirely missing from the Sega CD port. Jubei himself I've got to say, he does look excellent on Sega CD. Once again, the characters, they really did a fantastic job with them. About Haomaru himself, the tornado he shoots out is way simpler looking on Sega CD. Doesn't have as much detail. Next up, we face Nakaruru. She's fast, she's annoying, she's got an almost clairvoyant ability to understand when she needs to block, and can do it when controlled by the computer at basically any time, even right after a heavy move. Incredible. As for the background, this one has to duke it out with Jubei's stage for the most cut down background from the Neo Geo original. First, let's look at the ground again. In the arcade, we have a nice, simple repeating pattern with little splashes of color strewn throughout. There are what look like animal paw prints up near the house. There are 3 circular things hanging on the left side of the railing of the house. The right side has some jars, a distinct owl, some bags or pouches of some kind hanging under the owl, and what looks like a snow-covered pile with some food on top of it, and a cow with a bird on its head. When we look at the people on the stairs, we can see more stairs behind them. If we scroll to the sides of the screen here, there are lots of animals in this stage. On Sega CD, they really butchered this stage. And considering it's the stage with all the animals, that's kind of ironic, I suppose. The ground looks terrible. It's mostly blank, with a very simple 2-colored dither pattern that goes up about halfway to the top of the screen. All the little paw prints in the snow are gone. There's only 2 little round things hanging off the left side of that railing. The bags or pouches are missing from underneath the owl, and you have to look really hard and almost squint to even see the owl because of the colors they used for it. And the snow pile down on that right side looks like it's filled with shit now, and we're missing the cow that's next to it. And there's just a black void behind the people on the stairs, and there are only 3 stairs. I have to say that, like with Jubei's stage, it really looks like they just didn't care much about this one. They could have and should have done better with it. The animals have noticeably more animation frames on Neo Geo, and there's a greater variety of animals. Now so far, there have been some animation cuts to characters, but most of them have been pretty insignificant. Nakaruru herself is no exception. However, her bird companion is a different story. There are some movements and animations that have been drastically reduced on the Sega CD port. Things that are very smooth on the Neo Geo original end up having just a few frames of animation on Sega CD. And here we are with Earthquake, the character and stage that are cut from several versions of Samurai Shodown, and you can probably understand why. If you saw my video on 11 facts about the Neo Geo that you maybe didn't know, you'll know that basically everything the Neo Geo draws to the screen is a sprite, and sprites can literally be taller than the screen on this system. So huge characters like Earthquake are no problem for the Neo Geo with the way that it handles sprites. However, on more traditional systems, where sprites have fixed sizes, like 32 by 32 or 64 by 64 pixels, then you've got a problem. It would have taken a lot of sprites to recreate Earthquake on Sega CD, and it might have resulted in noticeable flicker or slowdown, especially if both characters were playing as Earthquake. Now, having said that, people are doing amazing things on the Genesis these days in the homebrew scene, and it's March 2024 as I record this. Some people have put out demos with 2 characters in a fighting game made of sprites that are roughly the same size as Earthquake on the Neo Geo, and there's no slowdown or flicker at all. But the tools people can use today were not available back then when this game was made. Anyway, having said all that, I hate Earthquake. He's nothing more than a gimmick, really. Just something that the devs put into this game to help wow people with his size back in the day. The truth is, his size actually hampers the gameplay significantly, and you end up clumsily fumbling around him most of the time. But at least Earthquake manages to keep things classy by literally grabbing you, shoving your face into his butt, and then farting on you. Now, I do believe the books written on the subject of etiquette would be against that. But seriously, I don't like this character and feel like the whole game would have been better off without him. His stage is okay, if a little on the bland side, and the music here is pretty decent, so at least there's that. And as annoying as I find this gimmick character, I do have to admit that it is impressive to see him moving around the screen, so mission accomplished with that one, SNK. Okay, we're in the home stretch here, folks, just a few fights left. Hanzo's bleak, desolate stage comes off really well in the Sega CD version. I think the darker background colors really set the tone here. The arcade one is fine and obviously has way more color in it, so no argument over which one is technologically superior, but artistically, I prefer the darker colors on the Sega CD for this stage. Now unfortunately, the Sega CD does lose quite a bit of detail from the arcade version here. The patchy grass is much more unique on Neo Geo, while it's made of very simple patterns on Sega CD. Also, we lose all the detail about halfway up the screen. How come? The broken down garbage in the background in the arcade is barely even there on Sega CD. The ground pattern is vastly simplified on Sega CD, and I just don't know why, again, that they just took shortcuts when constructing this level. Foreground elements like the taller plants are also missing. Now what the Sega CD port does retain here is the color cycling red sky, and the effect is very nice. It's modified a bit from the Neo Geo game, and what appears to be a fire on the horizon on the Neo Geo is missing from the Sega CD. Instead, it just uses some colors cycling upwards there instead of downwards until they come up to a point where they meet the ones that are cycling down. In the Neo Geo version, the section with this fire is completely animated instead of just a simple color cycling effect. Interestingly enough, the Sega CD version adds an effect not present on Neo Geo. The torn flag or canvas or whatever that is in the background, it flaps in the wind. On Sega CD, we get to see it animate. On Neo Geo, it just lays there motionless. Finally, the shadows cast by the objects in the arcade are nice and sharp. Those same objects on Sega CD still cast shadows, but they're a lot less defined and have less detail. I should also note that the foreground grass is nicely animated on Neo Geo, and as I mentioned a moment ago, it's not even there on Sega CD. Alright, here's our last regular fight. This time we're up against Ukyo. And yeah, this is just a palette-swapped version of Haomaru's background, although I do prefer the nighttime colors in both versions of the game as opposed to the daytime colors. So anyway, I already told you about a lot of the differences in the background during Haomaru's fight, so we'll talk about something different now. Let's talk about those energy bars again. On Neo Geo, they have a gradient, meaning they're not one solid color, they're shaded. As I mentioned earlier, when you damage an enemy enough, the energy bar for that character starts to flash and a chime plays. This is great for warning you that, hey, you need to start paying attention now. You or the enemy are about to die. The lack of the visual effect or even the audio chime on the Sega CD version when a character's health gets low means that sometimes it's easy to take a fatal blow you had no idea was about to head your way. And I have no idea why the developers at Funcom took this feature out. They could have at minimum at least played the sound chime, even if they decided to go against the distracting flashing effect. So I also haven't talked about controls a whole lot yet. When I got this game originally on Sega CD, I'd already had the 6-button controller for a few years, and I've got to say, from a gameplay standpoint, I actually prefer playing this game on Sega CD to the Neo Geo, thanks to each attack having its own button. You see, on Neo Geo you get 4 buttons. The first 2 are your weak and middle weapon or punch attacks. The second 2 are your weak or middle kicks. To do strong weapon/punch attacks, you have to press the 2 weapon attack buttons together at the same time, and likewise for your strongest kick, you have to press your 2 kick buttons together simultaneously. You can get used to it, but I also find the button layout on the Neo Geo kinda awkward for this. On Sega CD, and also on the Genesis version, if you use a 6-button controller, the 2 rows of buttons each represent your weak, middle, and strong weapon/punch attacks, and the bottom row are your kicks. It just feels a lot more natural to play that way. Also, I can't sing the praises of the Genesis 6-button controller's D-pad enough. I'm glad we finally have a good amount of devices that mimic that Sega 6-button controller D-pad these days. Now on modern devices that you can play this game on, it's less of an issue, since you can usually assign a separate button to do the strong attacks, but back in the day that wasn't an option. And I'm not going to say the Sega CD version is better because of the controller. Very clearly the Neo Geo version has way more going for it. Still, it would have been nice to play the game on the original Neo Geo hardware using a more suitable controller back in the good old days. Alright, bonus round 3. Again on Neo Geo we have different colors than either of the first 2 bonus rounds. On Sega CD, it's the exact same bonus round for the 3rd time now. The arcade adds a second dummy to the ceiling, while the Sega CD version still just has the 3 dummies on the floor, exactly like the first 2 bonus rounds. Okay, here we are finally at Amakusa, the final boss in Samurai Shodown. And there's even some controversy here. In the Samurai Shodown anime that came out shortly after the game, Amakusa was clearly a woman in the English dub. However, that was apparently a serious mistranslation and misunderstanding. Amakusa is indeed male, and is the son of the character Hanzo, who in this game has been possessed by an evil spirit. People still mistake Amakusa for a woman based on some, let's say, ambiguous character features. But Amakusa is definitely male. So, that's settled then, right? Right? In the Sega CD version, Amakusa's animation frames have been cut in places, and several effects present in the arcade game are also missing. This is the character that I feel has the most noticeable animation cuts in the whole game. As far as the first part of the stage background, it looks mostly okay on Sega CD. Aside from some black voids in the grass and on the centerpiece stone, it's fairly close to the Neo Geo game. It is missing the candles on the ground next to the boulder. Now, of course, the colors are obviously reduced on Sega CD, which is what led to that problem of the black voids in the first place, and I think they could have cleaned this up a bit, but it's not too bad. Now, one thing that's a little bit weird here is they took out Amakusa's flashing when they go across the screen, but I do love that they kept the animation of him falling into his pile of clothes and vanishing, and also turning into the meteor, basically, and smashing down onto you in the middle of the screen. So, it's pretty impressive a lot of the things they did keep, even though, as I mentioned just a moment ago, the animation of Amakusa is cut, noticeably. And while we finish off round one here, let's pause at a silly place where the screen transition is in the middle of happening. I actually wanted to do this so you could get a good look at the ropes on the rock and the ornamentation on it, so you can see how close they did actually manage to get in the Sega CD version. It's kind of surprising, really. Now for the final round, the background will transform. On Neo Geo, Amakusa summons up columns of fire and eventually what looks like a demon in the background with white animated lines circling around it and mist splashing all around while the sky color cycles like crazy with loud pastels. The sky is especially annoying to look at during this fight. On Sega CD, the second part of the fight looks way worse. First off, we lose the transition where Amakusa shoots out the fire columns from the ground. We do have the animated lines, but they're a lot simpler, and that's also pretty much it. The mist is just a solid picture, and it looks terrible. Having it animate would have been really simple, and it's one of those things where I just can't imagine why they didn't do it. While I'm glad the loud color cycling effect from the sky is gone, they should have replaced it with something. Maybe some menacing clouds. But it definitely needed something, it just looks way too plain and barren as it is. Despite the aforementioned cut animation frames, Amakusa in general really does look great and very close to the Neo Geo original, so I do want to give them props for that. Now after we put Amakusa down permanently, well, that's it. At long last, Samurai Shodown has been completed, and we don't get much of an ending. Oh well. Alright, so there we are, just counting down my score in the arcade version. We get this nice little flashing screen of Amakusa's crystal balls smashing into a million pieces. Well, more like 4 than a million, I guess. And then in the arcade, we get a quick view of Amakusa slowly sort of folding into himself, disintegrating, and maybe teleporting away somewhere. Sega CD, they actually skip that part, and they go straight to the next phase of the ending, which is Haomaru just standing there, while who I can only presume is his girlfriend, Oshizu, coming up to him and saying, "Oh, please don't go." But he says that he's a samurai, a rebel guy, and that they have to part. Because I guess that's what all samurais have to do, right? I love that he just tells you to be brave, also. Be brave while I go away forever. And then immediately, we see him with Mai from the Fatal Fury series. What's really weird here is look how dithered that background is on the Sega CD version. It wasn't like that when we were actually fighting on this stage. So then on Sega CD, we get an actual credits scene. On the arcade, it just shows you how many times you continued and stuff. So I told you, this wasn't about my gameplay. You can see I continued 29 times in the arcade version while recording this. So we don't get that same information on Sega CD, but that's fine. Instead, we just get to look at the staff. Though JVC was the publisher, while Funcom was the developer. Oh, so that's why we're seeing a lot of JVC names in the credits here also. So, in the end, I mean, it sounds like there was a lot of things that were removed from this version, and, honestly, there were. But it's still, even with all that stuff removed, it plays very similarly to the arcade version, and in some ways, thanks to the controls, can even be better to play. It doesn't look as good. It doesn't sound as good because of the terrible sound effects, but also having that arcade music really helps the atmosphere of this one a lot. So overall, in the end, I've got to say that I actually like this game. Now, it did come out a bit late. Since it hit in 1995, I mean, the Saturn was already out at the point this game came out. So this was very late in the lifetime of the Sega CD. If it had come out a little bit earlier, it would have had a much stronger impact, I think. Wouldn't have been a huge hit, but it definitely would have done better and probably been more remembered. Alright, so there you have it, a complete playthrough comparison of Samurai Shodown on the Neo Geo and Sega/Mega CD. Here are some final thoughts on both versions. First, as I said before, the Neo Geo hardware is significantly more powerful than the Genesis or Sega CD, so the Sega CD version was never going to be an exact match. At first glance, it seems like outside of the loss of the scaling functionality, that the Sega CD version is really close to the original, but on closer inspection, we can see quite a few things were cut. So to sum up the things that it's missing, the character Earthquake and his stage are gone, the destructible items in the foregrounds of stages are gone, the scaling feature is gone, Hikiaki in the background running by to throw the extra items on the playfield is gone, the bomb item is gone, the referee in the background is gone, the button tap icon during a weapon clash is gone, a few sound effects are gone, cutting opponents in half with certain moves at the end of a final round is gone, and a whole bunch of voices are gone, especially the announcer at the beginning and end of the fights. Now, the low quality of the voice samples during the game is also a little jarring. The bonus rounds are also quite compromised, missing the dummies from the top of the screen in the second and third bonus stages. Some backgrounds are also very simplified. Now, even with all that missing stuff, I do think that overall, Funcom did a good job with the Sega CD version of Samurai Shodown. As I said, there's a slight gameplay advantage to this one over the original, since you can play it with a 6-button gamepad and not have to hit 2 different buttons together to execute your strongest attacks. That alone made the gameplay feel better to me than the Neo Geo version, even though I fully admit the Neo Geo version is better in every other way. But hey, those buttons are important, and the Neo Geo version is definitely the superior version of Samurai Shodown when all was said and done. But if you had a Sega CD already, you could have gotten yourself a pretty decent, albeit cut-back version of the game at home for an affordable price on an affordable platform. So what do you think? Do you have fond memories of playing Samurai Shodown on Neo Geo or Sega CD? Have you ever seen the Sega CD version before today? Are you angry at all the cuts made to the Sega CD version? Tell me all about it in the comments. That'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please like it and share it online somewhere. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss one of my videos. If you want to support the work that I do here, you can do that on Patreon or Ko-fi, or right here on YouTube through channel memberships. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.